fans, it's your boy Luke here for our Week 13 main slate picks. Going to go position by position, covering the core foundational plays for our main slate contest this week. Week 12 was a little bit of a doozy. We had some massive performances from some low-owned options. So anyone out there that had Leonard Fournette or Joe Mixon, congrats. You probably won a lot of money last week. But moving on to this week, we have some high over-under games, some divisional matchups I'm really looking forward to. And overall, of course, our main slate GPPs to try and take down as well. So without any delay, let's hop right into it. First off with our quarterbacks here for Week 13. First off, I'll be targeting Matt Ryan playing against the Buccaneers. This is going to be one of the higher scoring games of the weekend, and I personally project him relatively high, especially at $5,600. He's been a little bit of a sneaky play to this point of the year. Obviously, doesn't bring any rushing upside to the table, which kind of limits his upside, but at the same time, has been consistent right between that 17 to 22 point range. And in this matchup against the Buccaneers, I fully expect him to be playing from behind. The real attractiveness about a Matt Ryan stack is that he's not only cheap, but a lot of the stacking options are also cheap as well. Kyle Pitts might be a more expensive tight end, but in the grand scheme of things, in terms of a top end stacking option, really doesn't cost you all that much. Of course, going to somebody like Russell Gage, potentially even in Olamide Zaccheaus, going to be cheap options as well. So if you go to this Atlanta stack, can definitely pay up for some of those stud running backs or wide receivers to round out the rest of your lineup. Next up, we have Jimmy Garoppolo, who's going to be without Deebo Samuel at wide receiver. He's currently doubtful to play this weekend, which is definitely a large hit to this offense. But just like a Matt Ryan, he's been a sneaky option to this point of the year, averaging 17 fantasy points per game. He's also somebody who's going to have some cheap stacking options this week. Not only do we have George Kittle, who's vastly underpriced, we'll get to him a little bit later on at tight end. We also have options like Brandon Ayuk we can go to, or even those running backs like Elijah Mitchell that have been highly productive to this point of the year. The Seahawks defense has not looked good. Their tackling is good, but their secondary is poor. So they're like Swiss cheese. You can dice them up every which way you'd like. So Jimmy Garoppolo, again, even though he doesn't pop off the board, he's not a super sexy pick or anything like that. All the metrics point to him having a very good week here. And I like a lot of the stacking options that are lower priced than they should be. Next up, we have Lamar Jackson. He is the most expensive quarterback on this slate, but even against my hometown Steelers, I do expect him to have a very good game. Anytime the Steelers play him, they've had success in the past using a spy against him, that being Devin Bush, but Devin Bush has regressed immensely this year. I have no idea what's going on with him. He had that devastating ACL tear last year. It has looked horrible this year. He doesn't even look like an NFL caliber player. He's gotten burned the last 6 weeks for touchdowns. I can just tell you because I've seen them week after week. A couple times he's gotten burned for multiple touchdowns in games, and that is not going to bode well against Lamar Jackson. I fully expect him to have that rushing upside once again against the Steelers team, and this secondary is already hurting. So if they're having to deal with that rushing threat from Lamar Jackson, then they're complete toast. So I expect him to have a very good week and a little bit better week passing than he would typically have as well. A lot of times I'm not looking to stack up Lamar Jackson and those Ravens, but against this weak secondary, again, I would know as a Steeler fan, they could see a lot more success than they're used to seeing. So using somebody like a Marquise Brown, potentially going to a Rashad Bateman or Mark Andrews could definitely make a lot of sense. Next up, and 2 of the next 3 quarterbacks are going to be from the same game. A lot of my picks in general this week are going to be from the Chargers-Bengals game. Also, obviously, like going here to Joe Burrow. He's $6,300 this week. The matchup is ideal. Both these offenses like to run with a lot of pace, throw with a lot of volume as well, and overall aren't the best on defense. Really looking at an ideal matchup in terms of fantasy scoring from both ends of the spectrum. Definitely like Herbert a little bit more than Burrow. That's why Burrow's here at number 3 rather than number 1. But definitely has just as much upside as somebody like a Herbert. I've seen this game being a little bit closer to a 65 to even 70 point total and an absolute goldmine in DFS. Next up, we have Matthew Stafford at $7,300. Is likely to be lower owned than this week than he really should be. A lot of it comes down to the injuries that we've heard about. He's dealing with back pain. He's dealing with elbow issues. He's dealing with a foot pain as well. Just across his entire body is having some type of an issue. So there is a little bit of skepticism behind him, but despite those injuries last week, was able to perform well and score 27 fantasy points, and now he gets a cupcake matchup against this Jacksonville team. So I fully expect him to take advantage of that, and if the public's going to come in with less than 8% ownership, as it is right now because of those skepticism and a lot of the question marks surrounding him, I'm definitely going to be all over him at a 23.6 point projection. And our last quarterback, going to be Justin Herbert at $6,700. Again, on the other side of that Bengals-Chargers game, I like his side a little bit more because of the stacking options. You have elite tier options in terms of Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, potentially even Jared Cook. So essentially, just take the three that you like the best there, make a super stack, and run it back with one of the guys on the Bengals. I'm looking at probably 40 to 50% of my lineups this week, either as a Burrow or a Herbert stack, and most of them having run backs as well. I'm expecting this to be, again, a gold mine. And even if I'm not using a stack from either of these teams, more than likely I'm going to have a lot of access to it, whether it's one-offs at wide receiver or tight end. And next up, we have our running backs. First off, we have Austin Eckler, again in that really high total game with the Bengals. Really like him there at $8,300. The only reason he's not higher on this list, of course, is the price tag. He's $8,300, one of the most expensive running backs on the slate. I do think it's warranted, though. He comes in at a 19.2 point projection. And not only is this game expected to shoot out, Austin Eckler is somebody who can give you that PPR upside. So even if he's playing from behind, even if this is a higher paced game than we expect, he's going to be out there and still going to be contributing, which can't really be said of most running backs in the NFL. So really like him there at that price tag. Again, using him in stacks with Justin Herbert gets really pricey. You're having to make a lot of sacrifices across the rest of your lineup. So perhaps he's not the best stacking option, but as one-offs or a buyback for a Burrow stack could definitely make a lot of sense. Next up, we have Alexander Mattison, who is expected to start for this Vikings team this week. As of right now, Dalvin Cook's expected to sit for a week or two, is dealing with a knee injury, and it doesn't look like they're really going to push that injury, particularly if they're playing a team like the Lions that they're expecting to be able to get a win at least relatively easily here. Steelers weren't able to do that, but Vikings, a much more sound team, much more well-rounded, should not have those kind of issues. Obviously, the matchup is ideal. The Lions rank as one of the worst teams in the NFL against opposing rushing attacks. So I have them at an 18.5 point projection, and Madison is definitely priced up for the occasion. There was a lot of speculation towards the beginning of the week that Dalvin Cook would be out, so DraftKings did the right thing with their algorithm and priced him up, which in my opinion makes him a better play. Because if he was coming in close to $6,000 like he was earlier on in the year, he's going to come in with 50 to 60% ownership. And we saw that on that slate. And of course, he ended up paying off that chalk. I was there as well. It was almost unavoidable. In my opinion, DFS is better when we have pricing that's correct. When we're not dealing with these completely mispriced guys that everybody's on, it makes it more interesting. You have to be sharper with your takes. So with that being said, still going to have them in my player pool. They're expected to win this game big against the Lions, and Madison's going to have a lot to do with that if they end up getting that done. Next up, we have Joe Mixon, who tore up my Steelers last week. On the other side of that Chargers game, really like him there at a 19.6 point projection. If I'm taking a stack on the Bengals side, probably not using Joe Mixon. A little bit better of a run back if I'm using a Charger stack. So that's really what I'm doing with both of those running backs. They both bring a ton of upside to the table. They're both relatively expensive as well. The beauty about using a Joe Burrow stack is that we can get to Eckler, who's a little bit more expensive. And if we want to get to Joe Mixon, we can go to Justin Herbert. And rather than taking somebody like a Keenan Allen or an Austin Eckler, we can use somebody like a Mike Williams to make up that salary. So in either permutation that we try to go to, there are guys that we can take to save some salary to make it work. So you can definitely fit those guys into lineups. And again, I like that game in general, as you'll see with our tight ends and our wide receivers. And they are not excluded from that pool. Next up, we have James Conner at $5,900. I have no idea why he's priced here. He's going to be the clear number one back for this team with Chase Edmonds not activated from IR. Also a really good matchup against this Bears team. And even though they do have a strong front seven, we're expecting this to be a very positive game script. And if James Conner is going to get 25 to 30 touches, he's definitely going to get out there and at least pay off his price tag. So I currently have him projected for 18.1 points, which is over 3x value, with the upside to potentially put up a 25-plus point game. At number 2, we have Leonard Fournette, who was Mr. Touchdown last week, was doing his best Jonathan and Taylor impression, putting up a ton of points at his price tag. I like going back to him here against a weak Falcons team. Obviously, the Falcons are no strangers to letting up a ton of points. We've already talked about how I like Matt Ryan as a potential garbage time threat. Leonard Fournette, though, as just a pure player in that game, I expect him to be well. Somebody who's going to get touches when they're ahead, especially if they're behind as well. They've used him a lot in terms of PPR as a receiver out of the backfield. And in general, he brings high upside to the table, but also a relatively high floor. You know he's going to get the catches out of the backfield. You know he's going to get you 70 to 80 rushing yards. The real upside comes with those touchdowns. And just because he had a huge game last week does not mean I'm going to be avoiding him. It's not like golf where we have 156 other players to go against in the field, and it's really hard to repeat a good performance. Here in the NFL, you can ride hot waves. You can get on that hot streak, get a lot of usage, that kind of thing. I like riding the wave here with Leonard Fournette. Speaking of riding the wave, Jonathan Taylor is by and far the best running back play on this slate, even at $9,200. Quite frankly, it comes down to this Texans defense. Have not been the best unit this year against the run. In general, this Texans team is not the best team in the NFL. So as a result, this Colts team that is coming in with a ton of momentum, I'm expecting them to come out and absolutely show out this week. And in those type of game scripts, you're talking about 30 to 35 touches for Jonathan Taylor. Just an absolute monster usage guy. Somebody I'm expecting to get upwards of 20 fantasy points in almost every single game he goes out there, particularly in a positive game script. So currently at a 24.1 point projection, not quite the 3x value, but when we start to get above 20 points, it doesn't really matter the price tag. You're looking at trying to cap in those raw points, really trying to take advantage of people that have those high ceilings. And now on to the wide receivers. First up, we have Brandon Ayuk, who's somebody who I mentioned you can stack up with Jimmy Garoppolo. He's relatively cheap on the slate, has a great matchup against the Seahawks secondary, which ranks as the bottom 10 unit. So at a 17-point projection, definitely gives you a relatively high floor, but at the same time, a really high ceiling. Again, Deebo Samuel is out for this matchup, which means that Ayuk's only going to get about a 15 to 20% increase in usage. And I say only pretty facetiously there. Obviously, that is a big deal, particularly when it's somebody who has about a 15 to 20% usage rate to begin with. So probably going to get about double the touches that we expect from him week to week, which makes him a great projection here. Next up, we have Keenan Allen at $7,500. Somebody you can obviously stack up with Justin Herbert. He's a little bit pricier than I'd like, but as a result, not likely to get as much ownership as he deserves. This Bengals-Chargers game is going to be a shootout. We've already talked about it multiple times now, so it's no question or shouldn't be a surprise that somebody like Keenan Allen, who's going to get a ton of targets, is very effective in PPR formats, would be a priority for me. Next up, we have Jamar Chase on the other side of that game. I've talked about him a few times on this channel of late, and he's put up some all-right performances, 15 to 20 fantasy points. Not quite what we saw earlier on in the year, but the guy's going to have one of those games sometime soon. He did it essentially the first 7 games of the year, and if he's going to return to one of those ceiling-type performances, why not against this Chargers secondary that lets up a ton of yardage, lets up a ton of points, and again, runs with a ton of pace. There's going to be a ton of offensive plays in this game. So for me at $7,000 is somebody I'm buying back in on. I currently have him at a 19-point projection, but a true 30-point ceiling. Next up, we have Mike Evans at $6,700. Also somebody I'm going back to this week. He didn't have the best game last week. Ended up just getting by, really, didn't separate himself in a positive or negative light. But this week against the Falcons, I do expect him to have a little bit more success. I have him at a 19.2 point projection. Obviously this secondary, one of the worst units in the NFL. They're also relatively undersized. That means that somebody like Mike Evans that has a very large frame, closer to a 7-footer's frame rather than a 6'8" guy like he is going to be absolutely dominant. He's faster than a lot of their secondary, a lot bigger, a lot stronger, and I expect him to impose his will, particularly in the red zone. Next up, Mike Williams. It's just a trend of us going back to guys we had last week. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the people we were targeting last week also have good matchups this time around. And Mike Williams on the other side of that Bengals game, great option here at $5,700. He's just clearly mispriced. And even though he didn't have that massive game you were looking for last week, he's still in that same type of situation. And I'm willing to go back there. I'm not going to let that one game sample size really deviate me from the fact that early on in the year, this was one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. He was averaging over 24 fantasy points per game through week 6. Had a little bit of a dry stretch there due to a little bit of health problems. Had a hamstring injury that was lingering. Went off against the Steelers, and then had one bad week last week. So if people are going to be off of Mike Williams, makes him an even better play here. Even if he's chalk once again, I'm going to be on him. It's just a great matchup here against the Bengals. He takes the top off of the defense and has true 30-point ceiling. But at number 1, Cooper Kupp. This is probably the 8th time this year that Cooper Kupp's been the number 1 wide receiver on my list. At $9,000, a great matchup against this Jaguars secondary. A great stacking option with Matthew Stafford. I mean, every single week, you essentially want to have some Stafford Cup stacks. I'll probably mix in a Van Jefferson or Higbee and call it a day. I mean, it's just very consistent offense there, very concentrated offense as well. So much like that Minnesota Vikings team, where they really only use 3 to 4 guys and split their usage between those people, it's the same over there in LA. For them, it's Cup, it's OBJ at this point, I suppose, Van Jefferson Jr., and Tyler Higbee. That's really about it. They're not going to many other players in that offense. So as a result, you're looking at high scores from these players week in and week out, particularly if they go out and score 35 to 40 points. You're looking at ceilings from 3 to 4 of those people. It's one of the teams where I'm actually willing to have 3 skill position players from them. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. I'm willing to have all those guys in the same lineup because they're so concentrated. So Cooper Kupp at $9,000, averaging over 27 fantasy points per game. Can't go wrong. Our first tight end will be Foster Moreau. Very cheap this week, starting for the hurt Darren Waller at $2,700. The matchup against the Washington football team is also a top 5 matchup in terms of tight ends. So at just a 11.1 point projection, not like he's going to go out there and break the slate, but we're expecting him to get plenty of usage in this offense. Even when Darren Waller is healthy, he does play snaps, definitely has a role in this offense. They love throwing to the tight end over there in Las Vegas. So with the matchup, with the type of volume we expect for him, should be relatively easy to pay off that price tag. So really like him there, particularly if you're looking to spend up from one of these premium stacks. Next up, we have Rob Gronkowski. And comes in at $5,300 playing against the Falcons. We've already talked about how it's one of the best matchups on the slate. And last week he was chalk, ended up paying it off, was one of my most owned plays on the slate. This week it's looking the same. He didn't get much of a price hike from where he was last week. People were all over him, were paid off, and I expect him to be chalk once again. So perhaps you want to fade him because he's chalk. That's not going to be the case with me. I think that this is well-warranted chalk, but I could totally understand if you took that angle. Next up, we have Mark Andrews, who's my favorite stacking option to use with Lamar Jackson. Like I'm there at $6,000, and even though he's pricey, at the top of the board this week, it's going to be a little bit jarring for most people. The matchup against the Steelers is ideal. We've already talked about how Devin Bush is an absolute dumpster fire, is letting up a touchdown or two seemingly every single week. Guess who's going to be matched up with Mark Andrews in the red zone? You got it, your boy Devin Bush. Go ahead and fire up all of the Mark Andrews this week at a 16.2 point projection. Third, we have Logan Thomas at $4,000, who we thought was going to be on a pitch count on Monday Night Football, but really wasn't. He was out there for seemingly every single offensive snap, which is great to see. This guy's a top 5 tight end in the NFL when he's playing. So the price tag is still low because of the injury, because of some of the concern that people have with him. But the matchup against the Raiders isn't anything to shy away from. And at a 14-point projection, I think he ends up being one of my favorite plays at the position. Next up, we have Dallas Goedert at $4,500. This guy is just a perennial guy on this list. He's going to be one of my favorite tight ends week in and week out. He's a key cog of this Philadelphia offense, and because of Jalen Hurts' ankle injury, I do expect them to be passing a little bit more than usual, particularly in the red zone. A main beneficiary of that type of a game script would of course be Dallas Goedert, who is the highest usage of any player in this offense. The kicker here is that the Jets secondary is horrible against tight ends. They're one of the best teams against opposing wide receivers, but against the big guys over the middle, definitely have a little bit of susceptibility. So at a 14.2 point projection, definitely somebody I'll be investing in. And now finally, at number 1, arguably my favorite play on the slate, with Deebo Samuel out of the San Francisco offense, George Kittle is going to have a massive usage rate. Close to 35-40% is what I have it projected for right now. So at $5,900, which seems way too cheap for him as well. Love the matchup here against the Seahawks. Jimmy G, we've already talked about him being an interesting stacking option. Somebody who's going to throw the ball a little bit more this week than we're used to seeing, just because that Seahawks secondary is so banged up. So at an 18.6 point projection, I think that's a little bit of a conservative route right there. He could easily score well into the 20s, but definitely will be one of my priority plays here for week 13. That is all I've got for my week 13 core picks. Go ahead and let me know down in the comments who you have as your favorite team to stack. Obviously for me, a few options I have it down to. I really like trying to target one of the stacks in that Chargers-Bengals game, but go ahead and let me know who you guys got. And of course, really appreciate all the support here on the channel. If you guys haven't already liked or subscribed to the channel, make sure you guys go ahead and do so. We're going to have even more NFL content coming throughout the week, whether it's our value plays, our fades and sleepers, our weekly DFS live stream we'll be doing on Sunday morning, or our showdown content. make sure to stay tuned for all of that. I'll have it all out this week and going forward. We cover golf here in the channel. We also cover the NBA, so make sure to subscribe so you guys don't miss any of that. We've got something for all of you out there. And good luck with all of your lineups for this week, guys. Let's go ahead and target some of those really tie-in stacks and print some cash.